Hello and welcome to the guide to the case paper for Ancient and Medieval Philosophy. So the paper is turned in potentially as first as a draft. The draft due date is when you should probably do the draft by, and it's submitted to Canvas by an assignment. You can do early drafts, multiple drafts, and you can of course choose to do no drafts at all. Drafts are scored and commented on, but are not graded. What that means is I'll put on a number, which would be the grade you'd get if you turned in that version of the paper as the final version, but it's not a grade because it doesn't count towards or against your final grade. The draft available until deadline is a final opportunity to submit a draft, and that of course exists because when you turn in a draft, I would need some time to look at it and comment on it, and then to get it back to you for you to rewrite it. And it follows the same rules as the journal draft. Be sure to, you can turn in as many as you wish up until that deadline. Now for the paper itself, the final version, there's three options to turn it in. And this is somewhat complicated, but there are good reasons for this. There's the on-time deadline, or +5 bonus deadline, which arose because of the question, is there extra credit in the class? And the answer is yes. If you turn the paper in on time for the +5 deadline, you get your base score +5. It has to be submitted to Canvas as a Word file or PDF that can be read by Canvas, because if I can't read it, I cannot grade it. No printed or email copies accepted. Everything has to go through Canvas. You get the +5 points simply by turning it in on time. Now, since this is extra credit, there's no extensions for this. Either you do it on time and get the extra credit or not. Now, what if something, goes wrong? Well, that's why there's a second deadline. The emergency deadline is a week after the on-time deadline. It's a full credit deadline for unexpected issues, or if you just want more time. You don't have to have any documentation. You don't have to get any permission to use this. You just turn the paper in for this deadline. The reason I have this is because, things sometimes happen in the semester that would result in the paper, not being able to be completed, like a mild illness, other work to do, etc. And to use this emergency deadline, you don't have to have any permission, don't need an excuse. You can just use it. And the purpose for this is in cases where there is, something that happens that prevents a person from completing the paper by the +5 deadline. Now, what if something goes seriously wrong? Like, for example, someone gets called up for National Guard duty for an extended period of time. Someone is, very sick or injured, etc. That prevents them from working on the paper for a long time, not just like, a few days or a week. In that case, if that occurs, contact me as soon as possible, provide the relevant documentation, and all appropriate, extensions will be granted. The paper, of course, has to be turned in, whether it's emergency deadline or +5 deadline, in a readable format on Canvas. And again, Word or PDF is the best way to do that. If you happen to be using a word processor, like on Mac, the Mac version, or some other form of word processor, be sure to save it as a file that can be read on Canvas. Again, safe bet is PDF or Word format. Now, the third option is the 50% deadline option. That arose because, one semester, a student said, "Oh, I totally forgot that there's a paper in the class, but we're graduating senior. What can I do?" And this is way at the end of the semester. Hence the 50% deadline. And this is used when there's no extenuating circumstances. It's just didn't get around to doing the paper. And this gives a chance to get some credit for it. Now, you may be wondering, why is there a penalty? Well, the reason is because, the paper was due earlier. And so a person has much more time to work on it, and etc. And so this can be turned in for partial credit. And after anything that's not done by then becomes a 0. I typically set this as being deadlining at the last possible minute. Typically the last day of finals, that Friday at 11:59 p.m. Double check this, of course, just to be sure that it's still the case. And the file, of course, must be readable, ideally Word or PDF. Now, you only have to turn the paper in once. Even though there's 3 possible deadlines, the paper only has to be turned in one time. So there's an overall paper grade, which is the best of those 3. And so what often happens is someone will not turn a paper in for the +5 deadline. I'll get a panicked email saying, I didn't do the paper for the +5 deadline, but I got a 0 on that. I got a 0 on my paper. Have I failed? And I'll reply back, oh no, the reason why there's a 0 on the +5 deadline was because there's no paper turned in, so that's a 0. And the overall paper grade is the best score out of these 3 deadlines. And at this point, there's a 0, and that's the best. And so if that does happen, for example, if you don't turn a paper in for +5 deadline, and then you turn your paper grade will be a 0 at that point, but if you turn a paper for the emergency deadline or the 50% deadline, then you get the credit for that, and the paper grade would change appropriately. So paper only has to go in once, and you get the best score out of those 3. Now for the case paper, here's how it's done. So this has a lot less sort of like specificity than like the typical summary and argument paper, because it could be on any case. And obviously I can't do a video on every single possible case. So first step is select your case. Either you pick one from the ones that are available or follow the guidelines for creating your own case. And this involves, having a case with an issue, in this case, relevant to ancient medieval philosophy. If you're not sure if it fits, ask me. And it can be kind of like somewhat loosely connected to ancient medieval philosophy. For example, if you wanted to use an example of one of the cases, like Plato's werewolf case, Plato didn't talk a lot about werewolves, but it's relevant because he uses, Plato's metaphysics. So it has to have, a connection. It can't just be, anything in philosophy, but it can be, fairly loose. But just to be sure, before putting time into it, check with me, just run the subject, pass me like, hey, I want to work on this. Does this work? So once you get your case, you'll have your issue, what the case is about, and then you'll have your position on the issue raised by that case, because it's an argumentative essay, and you'll think of reasons that support your position, and then potential objections to it, and then replies potentially back to that. Be sure to label the 4 sections of the paper. This is so I can know what to grade, and it helps organize it in terms of writing it. And the sections are the introduction, the argument section, the objection and reply section, and the conclusion section. The introduction section, pretty straightforward. It's worth 5 points. Should be 125 words or less because it's only worth 5 points. The current record, I think, is 6 pages for an introduction to a paper. They did get all 5 points, but it's a lot of work for 5 points. This contains your thesis statement, your case statement, your position statement, your argument statement, and some minimal background so the reader knows what you're talking about. So the thesis is just what your thesis is. The case is to, describe the case very briefly. And then, of course, your position on the issue you raised, and briefly how you're going to argue for that. And then, a couple of sentences of setup for the case. It's essentially like a super concise summary of what's going to go on in the paper. The argument section is worth 50 points, so it's the biggest chunk of the paper. Should be about 1,000 words plus. I don't grade by word count, but you have to have like a certain amount of words to do all the stuff that's needed. The first part will be the case information, where you let the reader know enough about the case so they know what's going on. And that's worth 10 points, so it should be appropriate length. Now, depending on the case you pick, you may need to say more and less about it. So if it's pretty obscure, which a lot of ancient medieval philosophy kind of is, you may have to say more about what's going on. If it's something that doesn't require a whole bunch of background, like Plato's werewolf, for example, then you could have less case information. The big chunk of it is the 40 points for arguing for your position. So everything in there should, beyond the case information, should be clearly stating your position and then backing it up with arguments. Everyone has different writing styles. It can be useful to kind of, before writing, brainstorm a bit to develop effective arguments and then do the arguing. In terms of how to argue, it depends on what your case is. You may do an analogy, you may do some arguments by example, you may do argument by intuition, all kinds of ways to argue. You're picking a case and it could be almost anything. So once you've finished the argument section, the next step is looking at objections and your reply. So the third section is objection and reply. It's worth 40 points, should be 500 words plus, and it needs to contain at least one objection, substantial philosophical objection against your view. So essentially what you're doing is hypothetically, you're reversing your position. You are arguing against your position on the issue. And the idea is to make this as good an argument as possible, so it's not like a straw person argument. Now, people sometimes ask me, but what if my objection is better than my argument? Well, in that case, just make your objection into your argument, make your argument into your objection, and done. Now, you need to have at least one objection. It's better to have one good solid objection than a bunch of like really short, minor, undeveloped ones. But you'll kind of need to fill up that, not necessarily like fill up the word count, but you want to have it substantial. So you may need a couple meaningful objections. Or if it's substantial enough, one objection would suffice. If you're wondering, is this enough? That's what the draft's for. Turn in a draft and I'll say, this is good. That's a good enough objection. You're all set. Or this is kind of weak. You might need like a stronger objection, build on it a bit. Or you might need, it's okay, but you might need like another objection to make it more substantial. Now, for each objection, you'll need to have a reply. And the reply is where you refute the objection. So in the argument section, you argue for your position. Here's my position. Here are my arguments. You raise an objection, what a reasonable, philosopher might say against you, give their argument, and then you reply back saying that although this position is reasonable to object against me, my position is better because. And you give a new argument refuting the objection, and then repeat as needed. And so you want to develop effective arguments, and of course you want to argue for this. And again, in terms of how to do this, it all depends on what case you pick and how you want to argue it. So if you do pick the case option, I'd suggest like asking me, send me an email saying, hey, what would be like a good way to argue for this, or at least do a draft so I can look at it and give some advice on that. So how is it assessed? Well, the cards of assessment are essentially these. I look for completeness, where you state your position, you address all the key issues, the clarity of the writing, of course, is it easy to follow, the quality of the presentation. I always recommend using paragraphs. It makes it much easier to read the paper. And as a pro tip, people tend to grade papers better if they have paragraphs. Purely psychological, no effect on the content, but people hate, well, I can't say all people, but most people don't like a wall of text because it's just punishing to read. So paragraphs, well used, are good. Also, organization. Does it have a good logical structure, smooth flow of ideas? If you're citing stuff, be sure to cite them, properly, whatever method is appropriate for your major. I include in the paper guide, how to cite stuff. And of course, the idea is to create as much as possible an original paper. I mean, we're dealing with ancient medieval philosophy that's been, picked over for thousands of years. So I do have a reasonable expectation of it's not going to be a super, super original, but maybe, it should be at least somewhat original. And of course, it should be the arguments and objections, replies should be relevant. And the most important thing, of course, is argument quality. Are the premises plausible in your argument, your objection, your reply? And is the reasoning, good? For the rubric, here's the rubric. It's pretty much what you'd expect from it. I have them in the paper guide, so I won't read the rubric at you. But if you're wondering how does it get graded, here's an excellent one and a good one, adequate, and then poor, and then, of course, last, the failing. The final thing to do is the conclusion, which is worth 5 points. 125 words or less, again, because it's only worth 5 points. And you just, pro tip, you just copy your introduction, paste it in your conclusion, change the tense from I will to I did, instead of I will argue, change that to I argued, and then replace the minimal background with some final relevant remark. Like if you're doing Plato's Werewolf, you might say, and thus we see that although Plato was writing long ago, his metaphysics is still relevant to the idea of the werewolf. And for real, I mean, you can actually make a pretty good case as to why why Plato's metaphysics of the forms would allow for werewolves. Now, in doing this paper, since it's an objection reply paper with arguments, some common mistakes that are grade killers are these. One is just doing a report. Instead of arguing, just simply saying, okay, this is what Thales said, or this is what Plato said, or this is what Aristotle said, which could be fine if the objective is to write a report. But with the rise of AI, reports are kind of pointless because AI can whip out a report in a couple of seconds. So not like a super, sadly not like a super useful skill anymore. I mean, it's still useful in case you don't have AI. There's also in some classes you might do a compare and contrast paper. Like you might compare, say, Plato and Aristotle's view of the forms. And if this was a compare and contrast paper, that would be fine, but it's not. And so it's not that that's a bad way to do a paper. It's just not the objective in this class. The objective is to have an argumentative paper as opposed to this is what, say Plato said, this is what Aristotle said. Another common mistake is just assertions with just no arguments. Just saying, just asserting things like given Plato's theory, werewolves are possible. Because. Arguments, but not a philosophical argument. An example of this would be, say, a purely religious argument, for example. Although a religious argument might work if it did have enough, philosophy in it, or for some reason like a legal or an argument from law. It has to be philosophical, which is super super broad. And of course, the two big grade killers would be it's just nothing to do with ancient and medieval philosophy. So even though that I'm allowing like a fairly loose connection. For example, one of the cases is Plato's werewolf. It's got to be about one of the philosophers or the core issues that they raised relevant to them. Because otherwise, it's not a paper for the class. It's just a paper. And then of course, plagiarism, always bad. Traditional plagiarism, copying someone else. Turnitin is super good at checking that and finding that. So I include a plagiarism checker in Canvas, recommend using that to avoid that from happening. I typically get, in a typical class, I get about 3 plagiarism cases per semester. And it's just paper just fails. I don't take it personally. I don't seek revenge or get mad. Just, apply the appropriate grade. For AI plagiarism, again, I don't, I mentioned this in class, but I don't auto-fail people because Canvas flags it as potential AI because it may not be AI, it could be a false positive. One thing we're all encouraged to use Grammarly, and Grammarly, when it rewrites papers, it's using AI because everything is AI these days. And so it'll often flag it as AI because it is, but that's appropriate use. If you write your paper and Grammarly is, you're using the Grammarly that FAMU provides, you're doing what you're supposed to. And obviously it would be wrong to punish people for using Grammarly. Now, in terms of even if I know the paper is AI, and I'm really good at spotting this, at least until the models get better, I don't fail based on suspicion. What I do is grade based on the merits, and I found that AI is really bad at writing philosophy papers. I mean, initially it looks like pretty cool. It's got all these big words and it seems to be very appealing. But then looking at it a bit more in depth, you realize, wow, this is just awful. It's just big words that mean nothing, which you may think well, what, isn't that just philosophy? Well, that's probably why it does it, because it's more of a stereotype of philosophy. So that's the sort of vague guide to the case paper, because it's a pretty, sort of vague option, because you get to pick your own case and you can even make up your own case, which means there are unlimited possibilities. So if you do pick the case paper option, I recommend, emailing me, especially if you're making it up your own, emailing me with what you're going to write on and asking for what would, some advice. Not required, but it's a risk to go and just write the paper and not, just kind of go on your own and hope that it works out. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.